Perhaps the soundest investment that can be made in the future of formal education and schooling at all levels is the implementation of a lifelong curriculum to help students develop their intercultural competence. Intercultural competence, defined as the capacity for navigating, negotiating, and adapting to cultural difference. We study math for a variety of reasons. It helps us to understand how to pay our bills and taxes, how to buy goods and services, how to drive safely, and how to measure a dosage of medicine. These are useful and necessary life skills that we learn beginning in childhood. As adults, it's necessary for us to be able to communicate effectively and successfully with people that we encounter in our lives every day, such as our bosses, our neighbors, our in-laws, but also with people whom we encounter that have the keys to the things that we need: physicians, realtors, bankers, pharmacists, mechanics, lawyers, psychologists, waiters, judges, our children's teachers, and the police. Let me come back to that one. In other contexts, sometimes we encounter more complex situations, such as those that arise in airports and on airplanes, in courtrooms, in classrooms, and sometimes more dire situations, like being on the southern border of the United States, where life can change or end with just a glance. Let me ask you a question. In your neighborhood, what does it mean if I were to step on your shoes? Or if I looked you up and down without flinching or turning away? If I sucked my teeth while I passed you, would that signal disapproval? Or maybe just that I happen to be eating something? What do these highly nuanced instances mean? That momentary flick of the head or the wrist or the eye, or even the absence of a response when we are accustomed to expecting the full-on expression of human emotion. Now, please don't misunderstand. This is not all about habits and customs, like how we study guidebooks to prepare us for our travels. It would be impossible for us to learn all of the nuances of every cultural group, every linguistic community, and every ethnicity that we encounter in most metropolises these days. In point of fact, in rural communities and villages, most likely every hospital has on its team at least one doctor or one nurse or one healthcare practitioner who hails from global shores. The point is this: we may not understand these strange expressions or unusual habits or behaviors or customs, but if we recognize in the moment that matters that they are heavily embedded with meaning, then it might govern the actions that we take, the way we move forward, our next step or our next approach. Now let me come back to the police. What if police forces were to study and receive training and intercultural competence development in compassionate masculinity, in gender equity? I think that the statistics around life and death that we are accustomed to seeing would be vastly different. And what if that instruction began when they were children and was embedded in the schooling that they received throughout before they ever became policemen and policewomen? Wouldn't you think that's worth a try? Parents, your children's education, the quality of the instruction they receive, and the way in which they are assessed are very important to you. Let's say that your cultural background is very different from the community in which you now live and where your child goes to school. But let's say that your teacher has misinterpreted or misunderstood some of your child's cultural habits. They make him or her uncomfortable. And as an example, they've placed your child in a lower level educational track where his or her progress is likely to be stunted. Would that be okay with you? Everyday occurrences and all of these kinds of encounters and relationships that we establish, in order for them to be successful, we need to be taught, starting from day one, the kinds of skills that we need to help us develop our intercultural competence. More than 2 decades ago, many healthcare professions began to embrace a standard that they referred to as culturally competent care. Georgetown University Health Policy Institute defines this as services that meet the social, cultural, and linguistic needs of its patients. Now, why is that important? Well, let's just say that your Chinese grandmother, who only speaks Chinese, wakes up in excruciating pain. And when you get to the hospital, the doctor asks questions such as, when did this pain begin? How deeply are you feeling the pain? What have you eaten today? Now, are there any interpreters on the staff of that hospital? That's the value of culturally competent care. Let me tell you a story. I was once in a class where the instructor talked about her father. Now, her father, in the country that they came from, was a very well accomplished man. He was highly educated, he was an author, and he spoke several languages fluently, one of which was English. Years later, when they moved to the United States, he became ill, and as a result of his illness, he lost the ability to speak. He would often have to engage in writing things down and having them read back or communicating with people in other ways. Once his daughter and he were engaged in this kind of struggle to communicate, and they were observed by a healthcare worker who they later overheard to say to her coworker, you know, these people who come here from other countries, they really should learn to speak English so that they can communicate. Ouch. Well, that made a lasting impression. And that instructor later became a teacher of intercultural communication. In fact, I think about the harm and alteration to people's personalities and their ways of thinking and doing and being that is caused by trauma of one kind or another, that is embedded in their backgrounds and we may never even know about. So, for example, think about your kind of oddball coworker, and I think we all have one, yes, that no one seems to understand. What if the question that was asked, instead of what's wrong with her, was, I wonder what happened to her? That's the importance of trauma-informed approaches and their value. Again, another part of developing our intercultural competence. Now, make no mistake about it. Globalization is an ever hard-charging arbiter of change, and it will not reverse itself. Hyper-globalized societies today are characterized by intermingling cultures. Humans are increasingly intermarrying and developing relationships across a range of ethnic, socioeconomic, national, regional, religious, linguistic, sectarian, non-binary, gender-conforming, and racial lines. And the hybridization of these intercultural contexts will become increasingly nuanced and complex. Now think about if your daughter's boyfriend's parents, who were Brazilian and Polish, were gonna come to dinner with your Apache grandmother, who happens to be very friendly with the Nigerian neighbor next door, whom she's invited. I can guarantee you that there will be more that you will feel uncomfortable about than what to serve for dinner. And what if you're spending an evening with your 3 friends who each happen to practice a different faith tradition, and what they most like talking about is the differences in their faith traditions? You might ask, intercultural competence, but isn't that just very theoretical? I mean, if we're comparing it with the math instruction that we receive throughout our lives, you know, at its core, math is quite concrete, right? And quantifiable and not subject to interpretation, although some mathematics researchers would disagree with you. But for the sake of argument, we might ask, how would educators establish solid curricular content for something as nebulous and theoretical as intercultural competence? What kinds of methodologies, theories, or standards and practices could we deploy across national guidelines? And what about assessment? Well, actually, in point of fact, we have been studying theoretical disciplines like psychology, sociology, and political science for centuries. And gifted and well-prepared educators, researchers, and theorists have produced new knowledge that broadens and deepens the importance of these fields, and that happens as constantly and consistently as the sun rises. So then you might ask, well, what would we teach and what would we learn? For example, we might learn about the dimensions of culture, where we come to understand that various societies differ broadly on how they approach concepts like time and power, and whether or not they might come from a very low context culture where the important thing is exactly what you said verbatim. That's what I'm going to hold you to. Versus a high context culture where the thing that matters most is the way you said it. Or we might learn the importance of how we were enculturated and acculturated. We might learn, for example, the iceberg theory, where we come to understand that events that happen are based on patterns, which are embedded in structures that are derived from mental models and that come from unconscious containers, deeply divided, deeply embedded meanings. And that's often why we do the things that we do. We might consider a deeply studied access to our own self-awareness. We might understand the power of ambiguity, or we might study the writings of, for example, the brilliant Ta-Nehisi Coates, or Nobel laureate and author Toni Morrison, who has written a brilliant treatise on belonging called The Origin of Others. Or we might study the writings of author and educator Robin DiAngelo, whose book, White Fragility, is very instructive, and where she says importantly, the practice of our lives is more powerful than the words we say. The point is that this field is expanding and burgeoning, and there are new developments all the time. For example, now one term that is more readily used is intercultural fluency, and my personal favorite, intercultural humility. So content abounds. I was privileged to live for over a decade in a very diverse modern society where values like generosity, civility, and trust shaped the everyday lives of its citizens, where multiculturalism was embraced at a very strong level, and where concepts like respect and honor were even modeled by its national leaders. Now, how did that show up? Well, for example, thievery was considered so abhorrent and was considered a dishonor for anyone's family who was labeled a thief, that property that was lost was often returned. As a matter of fact, people would go out of their ways to make sure that they were not associated with having stolen something. Here's another example. Differently abled people who in today's society we often call, unfortunately, disabled people. Well, in that society, they were officially known as people of determination. You see the difference? These examples just happen to highlight all the vastly different ways that people think. Now, unfortunately, in the contemporary American context, when we talk about diversity, we tend to latch onto the most familiar markers of diversity, those that we can see and that we come in contact with most frequently, such as color and race and ability and gender. The one that we often leave out is class and socioeconomic status, something that even as children, we quickly learn in terms of where we fall on that ladder based on the material culture that we encounter. And that unfortunately carries with us into adulthood, where sometimes those kinds of biases flourish undetected and mostly unnamed. Ultimately, I think this is all about courage. The courage that we need to bring forth the embodiment of curricular and pedagogical practices that will embed intercultural development throughout our formal educational systems at every level. After all, you know, the opposite really does go on in a very informal way. And for that, I turn to a song from the 1950s film South Pacific. I'm not going to sing it for you, but I'll tell you what it says. The context is that one character is commenting about the kind of racism and discrimination that he observes on the local island by the others who have come into that locality to work and, of course, to use its resources, because we're talking about a colonized society. And he says, you know, I noticed even the children of those people began to discriminate against the local population. How do they do that? Where do they get this from? And the answer by another character in the film says, they've got to be carefully taught. They've got to be taught before it's too late, before they are 6 or 7 or 8. They've got to be taught to hate who their parents hate. They've got to be carefully taught. I don't make educational policy and I don't develop curriculum, but I stand ready to help those who do. As a matter of fact, this is an invitation and I throw down the gauntlet. I think that we have to have the courage to help ourselves develop interculturally and establish this under a new essential framework in every educational system across the land. I'm going to leave you with the words of the phenomenal poet and writer, Oriah Mountain Dreamer, with an excerpt from her poem, The Invitation. She says, "It doesn't interest me where you live or how much money you have. I want to know if you can get up after a night of despair and grief, weary and bruised to the bone, and do what needs to be done to feed the children. It doesn't interest me who you know or how you came to be here. I want to know if you will stand with me in the center of the fire and not shrink back. It doesn't interest me who or with whom you studied or where, but I want to know what sustains you from the inside when all else falls away. And I want to know if you can be alone with yourself and if you truly like the company you keep in the empty moments."